New York City, September 1972. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glittered under magnificent chandeliers as the entertainment industry's most creative minds gathered for the annual Television Writers Awards. 420 of television's biggest names filled every seat, from legendary writers to breakthrough performers, all assembled to celebrate the art of television storytelling. At table 24 sat Dick Van Dyke, confident and gracious in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that genuine smile illuminating conversations with Mary Tyler Moore, Rose Marie, and Maury Amsterdam as they reminisced about their groundbreaking television partnership. The evening should have been pure celebration for Dick. 3 years after the Dick Van Dyke Show concluded its historic run, his career was flourishing with new projects. His influence on television entertainment was undeniable, and he had proven that his success extended far beyond any single show or partnership. But across the ballroom, seated at the head table like a proud father watching his creation, sat Carl Reiner. Carl was television royalty in 1972, a writer-performer whose creative genius had shaped American comedy for decades. As the creator, producer, and occasional performer on The Dick Van Dyke Show, Carl had crafted what many considered the greatest sitcom in television history. His vision, his writing, his understanding of comedy had created a show that redefined what television could achieve artistically and commercially. But Carl was also a man whose enormous creative ego had become entangled with a sense of ownership over Dick Van Dyke's success. At 50, he was increasingly frustrated by the way Dick's post-show career was being discussed as if Dick had somehow created his own success independently, as if the Dick Van Dyke Show had been Dick's vision rather than Carl's creation. If you've ever created something and watched someone else get credit for your work, you know exactly the kind of resentment that was building inside Carl Reiner. The problem wasn't just Dick's continued success, it was the way that success was being framed. Critics were calling Dick a creative genius, a television innovator, a performer who had elevated sitcom acting to new heights. They were treating Dick as if he were the auteur of his own success, when in Carl's mind, Dick had simply been the perfect vessel for Carl's creative vision. Carl had been drinking steadily throughout the elegant dinner, his famous wit sharpened by alcohol and the growing conviction that someone needed to remind this industry exactly who had created Dick Van Dyke's television legacy. He'd been listening to conversations about Dick's new projects, about his creative choices, about his artistic evolution, as if Dick had somehow developed these abilities independently. Dick, meanwhile, was genuinely honored to be among television's creative elite. He felt grateful for his success, respectful of the writers who had made it possible, and especially appreciative of Carl's role in creating the show that had defined his career. When people mentioned Carl Reiner, Dick spoke with enormous gratitude about the older writer's vision, creativity, and generosity in crafting a show perfectly suited to Dick's abilities. But Carl interpreted Dick's independent success differently. What Carl saw was an ungrateful performer who had benefited from Carl's creative genius, and was now being celebrated as if he had somehow earned that success through his own artistic vision, rather than simply being lucky enough to be chosen for Carl's masterpiece. The formal program began at 8:30, with presentations honoring various television writers and creators. Norman Lear received thunderous applause for his groundbreaking work. Aaron Spelling was celebrated for his commercial success, and the atmosphere remained warm and appreciative. When Dick was called to present the Excellence in Television Performance Award, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom. "Tonight we're celebrating something remarkable, the collaborative art of television, where writers, performers, directors, and producers come together to create something greater than any individual could achieve alone." He paused, looking around at faces that represented the entire creative ecosystem of television entertainment. If you've ever been part of a truly collaborative creative process, you understand the magic Dick was describing. When I think about the Dick Van Dyke Show, I think about the incredible privilege of being chosen to bring Carl Reiner's vision to life. Carl didn't just write a show, He created a world, developed characters, and crafted a voice that captured something essential about American family life. Dick's speech was generous and humble, acknowledging the creative foundation that had made his success possible. The beautiful thing about television, Dick continued, is that it requires every element to work perfectly. The writer creates the vision, the performer brings it to life, the director shapes it, and the audience completes it. Carl Reiner taught me that being chosen to represent someone else's creative vision is one of the highest honors in entertainment. Carl's table had gone quiet. Several people glanced at him, trying to gauge his reaction to being acknowledged with such obvious respect and gratitude. What I've learned from working with Carl Reiner, Dick concluded, is that real artistic success comes from understanding your role in a larger creative vision. I was incredibly fortunate to be the performer Carl chose to embody his ideas, and every success I've had since then builds on the foundation he created. Dick received warm applause and returned to his table as the evening continued. But Carl's mood had shifted considerably. Being mentioned in Dick's speech felt insufficient to him, as if this performer was offering token acknowledgement while accepting praise for achievements that belonged fundamentally to Carl's creative genius. As the formal program continued with Carl scheduled to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for television writing, his carefully maintained persona of gracious creator began to reveal sharper edges. When he took the microphone, there was an unmistakable intensity to his demeanor that his closest friends recognized as dangerous. Have you ever watched someone's gratitude turn into resentment when they feel their contributions aren't being properly acknowledged? That's exactly what was happening to Carl Reiner. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carl began, his voice carrying that distinctive intelligence that had made him famous. "I want to talk about what it means to create something in television, because I think we've gotten confused about the relationship between creation and performance." The room settled into attentive silence. This was Carl Reiner, one of television's greatest creative minds, about to share insights from decades of writing and producing. "When you create a television show," Carl continued, "you're not just writing scripts, you're creating characters, developing voices, establishing relationships, crafting an entire fictional universe. The performer's job is to inhabit that universe authentically." Several people nodded, expecting this to be a thoughtful reflection on the creative process. "I've been creating television for 20 years, Carl said, his voice taking on that edge that made his comedy cutting. "I've developed characters, written dialogue, shaped performances, and crafted shows that have defined American entertainment. And I've learned something important about the relationship between creators and performers." Carl's gaze swept across the ballroom, landing pointedly on Dick's table. "Some performers understand that they are vessels for the creator's vision. They bring skill, talent, and dedication to interpreting what the writer has imagined. Other performers begin to believe that they somehow created what they're performing." The atmosphere in the Plaza ballroom was beginning to shift as people sensed this was heading beyond theoretical discussion. "Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone," Carl continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I think it's important that we maintain clarity about who creates what in television, especially when performers start being celebrated as if they were the creative forces behind their own success." Carl looked directly toward Dick's table. "Take Dick Van Dyke, for example," Carl said, his voice carrying that perfectly timed delivery that had made him a master of both comedy and drama. Everyone celebrating him as a creative genius, praising his artistic choices, talking about his television legacy as if he somehow developed it independently. The ballroom went completely silent. 420 people stopped breathing as they realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. "But let's be honest about what Dick Van Dyke actually represents," Carl continued, his voice getting sharper and more pointed. "Dick is my ungrateful creation. He's a performer who achieved success by embodying my creative vision, and is now being celebrated as if that vision were somehow his own." If you've ever felt the moment when a room's energy turns from celebration to shock, you were experiencing what everyone in that ballroom felt in that instant. Dick's face remained composed, but something in his posture indicated he understood the seriousness of what was happening. Did Dick Van Dyke create the character of Rob Petrie? Carl asked rhetorically. Did he develop the show's voice, its relationships, its comedy style? Did he craft the scripts that made him famous? Carl's voice was getting more theatrical, more possessive. The answer is no. Dick Van Dyke performed brilliantly in a role I created for him. In situations I wrote for him, using dialogue I crafted for him. He was the perfect choice to embody my vision, but that doesn't make him the creator of that vision. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This had crossed from creative discussion into personal attack territory. Dick Van Dyke's success is entirely based on his interpretation of my creative work, Carl said with growing intensity. He's been celebrated, awarded, and praised for bringing my characters to life. But somewhere along the way, he seems to have forgotten who actually created the foundation of his entire television legacy. Carl looked directly at Dick with an expression mixing affection and resentment. So when I hear people praising Dick as a creative genius, when I see him being treated as if he invented his own success, I have to speak up. Because Dick Van Dyke is my creation, and an ungrateful creation at that. His entire television career exists because I imagined it, wrote it, and chose him to perform it. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in the Plaza Ballroom had ever experienced. 420 people held their breath, waiting to see how Dick Van Dyke would respond to this devastating public attack from the man who had indeed created his most famous role. If you've ever been accused of taking credit for someone else's work, you understand the complexity of what Dick was facing in that moment. Dick stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried clearly through the silent room. "Carl," Dick said simply, "are you finished?" "I'm finished when someone acknowledges the difference between creating something and simply performing it well," Carl replied, his voice still carrying that distinctive authority. Dick walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His movement was confident but respectful, like someone who understood exactly what needed to be said. "All right," Dick said, his voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about creation versus exploitation. Let's talk about what it means to collaborate versus what it means to control. And let's talk about the difference between being a creative genius and using that genius to take advantage of other people." You could feel the energy in the room shift as people realized this wasn't going to be a simple defense of performance versus writing. Carl's confident expression flickered as he sensed Dick's response would be more substantial than he'd anticipated. "Carl, you called me your ungrateful creation," Dick continued. "You suggested that my success belongs fundamentally to you, that I've somehow taken credit for your creative vision, that my career exists only because of your generosity in choosing me." Dick looked around the room, making eye contact with various writers and performers. Those are serious accusations, and I think everyone here deserves to understand what they really mean about collaboration, credit, and the way creative people treat each other. Dick turned back to Carl, his voice becoming more pointed. "First, let's talk about what real collaboration actually requires. You're absolutely right that you created the Dick Van Dyke Show. You developed the concept, wrote the scripts, shaped the characters, and established the show's voice. Those were remarkable creative achievements that I've never claimed as my own." Several people in the audience began nodding, appreciating the measured acknowledgement. "But Carl, creation isn't just about the initial vision, it's about how you treat the people who help bring that vision to life. And I think it's time we talked about the difference between being a creative leader and being someone who exploits creative relationships." The room was completely focused on Dick now, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "You want to talk about creation and ownership? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what happened with the writing staff during season 4 of our show." Carl's face began to change color, his confident demeanor wavering. "Tell them about Jerry Belson and Gary Marshall, Carl," Dick said quietly. Several people in the audience leaned forward, clearly recognizing these names, but unsure of the specific reference. Have you ever watched someone's carefully constructed narrative crumble when the full truth is about to be exposed? That's what was happening to Carl Reiner. No? You don't want to tell them? Dick asked. Then I will. Dick turned to address the room. During the fourth season of the Dick Van Dyke Show, Carl hired two young writers named Jerry Belson and Gary Marshall. They were incredibly talented, fresh out of college, eager to prove themselves in television. Dick's voice was getting more serious now. Jerry and Gary wrote some of the most memorable episodes of our show's entire run, episodes that were later submitted for Emmy consideration under Carl's name as executive producer and creator. Audible gasps came from several people in the audience. But that wasn't the worst part, Carl, Dick continued, his voice getting more passionate. The worst part was what you told them when they asked for proper writing credits. The room was completely riveted. You told them that as young writers working for an established show, they needed to understand that their job was to serve the show's vision and that individual credit would be inappropriate for writers at their level. Dick walked closer to Carl. Jerry Belson and Gary Marshall wrote episodes that won Emmy Awards, episodes that are still considered classics of television comedy. But they received no individual credit because you convinced them that asking for recognition would be unprofessional and might hurt their future careers. Dick paused, letting his words sink in. You want to know how I found out about this, Carl? Because Jerry told me about it 5 years later, when he was struggling to get work in television. He said that not having proper credits for his best work was making it impossible for him to prove his abilities to other producers. Dick looked around the room one final time. You called me an ungrateful creation, Carl. But the real difference between us isn't about who deserves credit for what. It's about how we treat people who contribute to our success. I've never taken credit for your writing. But you've taken credit for other people's writing while convincing them they didn't deserve recognition. The silence that followed was deafening. Carl Reiner stood there, his face a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been recognition that his own creative ethics were being exposed. Then something happened that no one in the Plaza ballroom expected. Carl's legs buckled and he dropped to his knees. At first, people thought he was having some kind of medical episode. Several people moved to help him. But then they realized what was happening. Carl Reiner, television's creative genius, was kneeling deliberately in front of Dick Van Dyke, in front of 420 people. If you've ever witnessed someone's entire self-image collapse when confronted with their own hypocrisy, you understand the gravity of what was happening in that moment. You're right, Carl whispered, his voice barely audible. God help me, you're right. Dick looked down at this legendary figure on his knees. This man whose creative vision had indeed launched Dick's career, now reduced to someone confronting his own exploitation of other creators. Carl, Dick said gently. Get up. I can't, Carl said, tears beginning to stream down his face. I can't get up. What I did to Jerry and Gary, taking credit for their work while convincing them they didn't deserve recognition. I became everything I always hated about this business. Yes, you did, Dick said quietly. But Carl, that doesn't mean you can't choose to be better to the writers who work with you going forward. Dick knelt down beside Carl, bringing himself to eye level. The question isn't whether you've taken advantage of young writers, Dick said. The question is what you're going to do to make sure other young writers get the recognition they deserve. Carl looked at Dick through his tears. How can I fix this? How can I make it right with Jerry and Gary? How can I give them the credit I should have given them years ago? You start by acknowledging what they contributed, Dick said. You stop hoarding credit for collaborative work and start sharing it appropriately. You use whatever influence you have to make sure other young writers don't get exploited the way you exploited them. Carl nodded shakily. I will. I swear I will. Don't swear to me, Dick said. Swear to Jerry Belson and Gary Marshall. Swear to every young writer who's ever been told they don't deserve credit for their own creative work. Dick helped Carl to his feet. The room watched in amazement as the creator and his star stood facing each other. Jerry and Gary were brilliant, Carl said, his voice stronger but filled with regret. They wrote some of our best episodes. I should have celebrated them, promoted them, made sure everyone knew what they contributed." The applause that followed was unlike anything the Plaza Ballroom had ever heard. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment, it was recognition of genuine accountability and long overdue acknowledgement of creative contributions. Carl turned to address the room, his voice shaking but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an enormous apology. I owe Dick Van Dyke an enormous apology. And I owe Jerry Belson, Gary Marshall, and every young writer I've exploited the biggest apology of my life." Carl's voice got stronger as he continued. "I came here tonight thinking I was defending the rights of creators, but I was really just protecting my own ego, my own need to control every aspect of the creative process. Dick Van Dyke never took credit for my writing, but I took credit for other people's writing while convincing myself I was protecting the show's integrity." Carl looked directly at Dick. "You're not my ungrateful creation. You're a collaborative artist who brought my characters to life while always acknowledging my role as creator. And you've shown more integrity about creative credit than I've shown in my entire career." If you've ever seen someone completely transform their understanding of their own behavior, you understand the power of Carl's admission. Over the next several months, the story dominated entertainment news. But the real story wasn't about confrontation or humiliation. The real story was about creative justice, proper attribution, and the possibility that even established creators could learn to share credit more fairly. Carl did reach out to Jerry Belson and Gary Marshall, working with the Writers Guild to ensure they received retroactive credit for their contributions to the Dick Van Dyke Show. He also established new policies for all his future projects, requiring that individual writers receive proper recognition regardless of their experience level. Years later, when Carl Reiner died in 2020, Dick Van Dyke spoke at his memorial service about the transformation he'd witnessed. "Carl Reiner taught me that true creative leadership isn't about hoarding credit. It's about ensuring that everyone who contributes to a creative vision gets the recognition they deserve." That night in 1972, Carl learned the difference between being a creator and being a collaborator. And he spent the rest of his career proving that even the most established creators can learn to share success more generously. The story of that night in 1972 became a watershed moment for creative attribution in television, proving that even the most revered creator-performer relationships needed to be examined for hidden inequities in how credit was distributed. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put Carl Reiner on his knees. It helped him stand back up as someone committed to ensuring that all creative contributors received appropriate recognition for their work. If you've made it this far, you understand something crucial about collaboration, creative integrity, and the courage required to stand up for people whose contributions have been minimized or ignored. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories about fighting for proper recognition, about ensuring that creative collaborators get the credit they deserve, about refusing to let exploitation hide behind artistic vision, then you understand exactly why moments like these matter. Because real creativity isn't about one person's genius. It's about recognizing and celebrating everyone who contributes to bringing an artistic vision to life. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is make sure that recognition reaches the people who deserve it most. But the transformation that began that night at the Plaza Hotel had consequences that reached far beyond the television industry. Carl's commitment to proper creative attribution became a model for how established creators could work more fairly with emerging talent, fundamentally changing how credit was distributed in collaborative creative projects. If you've ever worked in a creative field where your contributions weren't properly recognized, you understand exactly why what happened next was so revolutionary. 6 weeks after the confrontation, Carl made a decision that shocked the Writers Guild and the television industry. He announced that he was personally funding an investigation into credit attribution for the Dick Van Dyke Show, working with Guild researchers to identify every uncredited or undercredited contributor to the series over its 5-year run. "I realized that if I had been unfair to Jerry Belson and Gary Marshall, Carl told Variety in a rare personal interview, "I had probably been unfair to other writers, and I needed to understand the full scope of how my need for creative control had affected other people's careers." The investigation revealed a pattern that extended far beyond the two writers Dick had mentioned. Over the show's entire run, Carl had systematically undercredited young writers, editors, story consultants, and even some performers who had contributed dialogue or character development. "What we discovered," said Writers Guild investigator Patricia Henderson, "was that Carl Reiner had created an environment where emerging talent was expected to contribute significantly to the show's creative content, while accepting minimal credit in exchange for the privilege of working on a successful series." The investigation found that at least 15 different writers had contributed substantial material to episodes that were credited solely to Carl as executive producer and creator. Several had written entire episodes that were submitted for awards under Carl's name, while others had developed character arcs and running gags that became integral to the show's success. Have you ever wondered how many people's creative contributions have been lost to history because someone in power decided they didn't deserve recognition? That's exactly what Carl's investigation was uncovering. Carl's response to these findings became a model for accountability in creative industries. Instead of defending his past actions or minimizing their impact, he began a systematic process of reaching out to every undercredited contributor, offering both public acknowledgement and financial compensation where appropriate. The first person he contacted was Jerry Belson, who had indeed struggled professionally due to his lack of proper credits for his Dick Van Dyke Show work. The conversation lasted 8 hours, with Carl listening as Jerry explained how the missing credits had affected not just his career prospects, but his confidence as a writer. "Mr. Reiner told me for years that asking for individual credit would be unprofessional," Jerry recalled in a 1975 interview. "But what I learned later was that other writers on other shows were getting proper credit for similar work. I had been convinced that my expectations were unrealistic when they were actually completely normal." Carl didn't just apologize. He used his industry influence to help Jerry secure retroactive credits and to promote his subsequent work. Within 2 years, Jerry Belson had become one of television's most sought-after comedy writers, finally receiving recognition for talents that had been suppressed for nearly a decade. The same pattern was repeated with Gary Marshall and every other undercredited contributor Carl's investigation identified. But more importantly, Carl's approach to future projects changed completely. Starting in 1973, all of Carl's television and film projects included explicit policies requiring individual credit for any substantial creative contribution. Writers' rooms became collaborative environments where every participant's contributions were documented and acknowledged, rather than hierarchical structures where junior writers were expected to contribute anonymously. If you've ever been part of a truly collaborative creative process where everyone's contributions are valued equally, you understand how revolutionary Carl's new approach was for television writing. The impact extended far beyond Carl's own projects. Other established creators began examining their own credit practices, inspired by Carl's willingness to acknowledge past mistakes and implement systemic changes. The Reiner model, transparent documentation of creative contributions, and equitable credit distribution became a recognized standard in television production. Dick Van Dyke's role in Carl's transformation didn't go unnoticed in Hollywood. His willingness to confront his own creator about creative exploitation had earned him respect from writers throughout the industry, who had long felt powerless to address such issues themselves. In 1974, 2 years after the Plaza Hotel confrontation, Carl and Dick collaborated on a television special called Creative Collaboration: The Truth About TV Writing. The show featured Carl honestly discussing his past credit practices while demonstrating how his new collaborative approach was producing better creative results. "Working with Carl now is like working with a completely different person," Dick told Entertainment Weekly during the special's production. "The creator, who was so protective of his vision that he couldn't share credit, has become a creative leader who understands that sharing recognition actually enhances rather than diminishes the original vision. Carl's response revealed the depth of his transformation. Dick saved my creative integrity by forcing me to confront what I had been doing to it. I thought protecting my authorship meant controlling every aspect of recognition. But real authorship means ensuring that everyone who contributes to your vision gets appropriate acknowledgement. The special was both a critical success and an industry turning point, directly leading to Writers Guild policy changes that required more transparent documentation of creative contributions and more equitable distribution of screen credits. Carl's later television work also evolved dramatically. Instead of tightly controlled creative hierarchies, his projects became collaborative endeavors where writers at all levels were encouraged to contribute ideas and receive appropriate recognition. These collaborative shows often proved more innovative than his earlier work, benefiting from the diverse perspectives that Carl had previously suppressed. When the Television Academy established the Carl Reiner Award for Creative Collaboration in 1985, Carl insisted that the first recipient be Jerry Belson, acknowledging publicly that Jerry's uncredited contributions to the Dick Van Dyke Show had been instrumental in the series' success. Jerry Belson taught me that young writers don't threaten established creators. They expand our vision, Carl said during the award presentation. The episodes he wrote for our show were some of our very best, and the fact that he went uncredited for years was a failure of leadership on my part, not a protection of creative integrity. If you've ever seen someone use their platform to correct historical injustices, you understand the impact of Carl's public acknowledgement. The audience gave Jerry a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes, not just for his writing achievements, but for his patience in waiting over a decade for appropriate recognition of his contributions. When Carl Reiner died in 2020, his memorial service featured dozens of writers whose careers he had supported after his transformation. Jerry Belson, by then a successful television producer, delivered a eulogy that captured the real lesson of that night in 1972. Carl Reiner made serious mistakes in how he handled creative attribution during the early years of his career. But then he spent 48 years proving that people can change, that established creators can learn to share recognition appropriately, and that the most important thing about recognizing your mistakes is what you do after you realize you've made them. Jerry looked out at the audience of entertainment figures. Dick Van Dyke confronted Carl Reiner about creative exploitation not because he wanted to destroy his creator's reputation, but because he wanted to save it. And in saving Carl, he saved the careers of countless writers who benefited from the fairer, more collaborative creative environment that Carl chose to establish. The story of Carl Reiner calling Dick Van Dyke an ungrateful creation had become one of television's most important transformation narratives. It proved that even the most established, brilliant, and successful creators could learn to handle creative collaboration more fairly when confronted with the consequences of their actions. More importantly, it demonstrated that accountability in creative industries didn't have to mean destruction. Dick's approach, presenting facts calmly, focusing on systemic issues rather than personal attacks, and offering the possibility of redemption, had created change that lasted for decades and influenced an entire industry's understanding of fair creative attribution. If you're still reading this story, it's probably because you recognize something important about creative collaboration, fair recognition, and the courage required to stand up for people whose contributions have been minimized or erased. The Plaza Hotel that night had witnessed more than just a confrontation between a creator and his star. It had witnessed the birth of a new understanding about how creative credit should be distributed, how collaborative relationships should be structured, and how established figures should use their influence to lift up rather than suppress the contributions of others. And if you believe that stories like this matter, stories about fighting for creative recognition, about ensuring that collaborative contributors get appropriate credit, about transforming exploitative creative relationships into genuinely collaborative ones, then you understand exactly why Dick Van Dyke's courage that night created changes that are still benefiting creative professionals today. Because the most important creative act isn't making something new. It's making sure that everyone who helped make it possible gets the recognition they deserve. And sometimes, that requires having the courage to confront even the people who created the opportunities that launched your own success.